Thank you for joining the Strategy Huddle with My Strategic Plan. We will cover the topic, Creating Useful Measures for Execution. This segment has been edited from a larger webinar. More information and the downloadable presentation is available at mystrategicplan.com.
Next agenda item, of course, one of the questions that came in was, we're stuck on developing our measures. What are some tips or suggestions you have to create ones that are usable? Okay, so on our My Strategic Plan website, we have a whole section on the conceptual side of creating performance measures, and you can find tons of articles on performance measures, books, the whole thing, and they're all great, I'm sure. But we wanted to just share when you're sitting in front of your team or you're trying to create measures and coach people into getting the plan done, and it always seems like establishing the measures and targets are the last thing that gets done because it's just the one that people don't want to do because it's hard to do sometimes, I think. So we just wanted to share, again, some tips and some guidelines that you could use directly, either if you're helping people develop them or if you're having to do it yourself. So first of all, how do you know when you have good measures? What are they supposed to be doing for you? And just some ideas that are on the screen. We kind of get lost, I think, sometimes in the we're supposed to be doing this, we're supposed to have measures. I mean, the old adage of if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Well, that's fine, and I think that we would all conceptually agree with that, but when push comes to shove, we're instituting a pretty serious system in an organization, asking to drive accountability, asking to drive visibility into what is happening in an organization from a strategic perspective. And so not losing sight of that outcome that we're seeking from a measurement system. Here are some guidelines, or not some guidelines, here are some, when we know we have good measures some ideas that are on the screen. It should tell you whether your strategy is working or not. Really a lot of conversation around what's a strategic measure versus what's an operational measure. And while I don't have this on the screen right here, I thought this was kind of a good way to think about, so when we're talking about performance measures related to strategy, we're talking about measures that help us understand whether or not our strategy is working. And yes, as you cascade them down, they become operational. They go from maybe something you look at once a month. If you parse it down from perhaps customer loyalty is something you might look at on a monthly basis, but what's driving loyalty you might be looking at a more periodic basis, maybe on a weekly basis, and that is a bit more of an operational measure that lets you know whether your shipments are on time or there are defects in your product or whatever the case may be. But I think it's important, especially when we look at this, at whether your strategy is working, to differentiate between strategic measures and operational measures. It should focus employees and management boards on what matters most to success. What are we trying to drive for the organization? Those measures should help us provide that dashboard for whether or not we are moving toward that future state we're trying to get to. Empowering the team, providing the information, as Howard mentioned, to actually make course corrections. You can kind of see the others on here as communicating in understandable language. They need to be realistic, and they need to measure the right things. And that sounds pretty obvious as well, but I think sometimes we come up with measures that are really not realistic, that we actually can't get the data for, and so we just need to put in a proxy. And we need to make sure they're verifiable, because most of the time we sync those up with comp, and if we can't make them verifiable, then people get, obviously, understandably, a little bit frustrated. So those are just some ways to know we've got good measures when. Let's look at some guidelines to whether or not your measures are when you're putting measures together, some guidelines to think about whether they are working for you. They should explicitly define ownership. It should be a precise unit of measurement that's verifiable, so I said that again, and perhaps some milestones along the way. And I know Howard has a lot of thoughts on this as well. He's been working with a lot of organizations recently in developing effective measures. Anything you want to add on guidelines or what makes them work for you?
Interestingly enough, topic has come up quite a few times, and that's one of the reasons we added that to our Strategy Check newsletter last month. And I think we're going to continue on with that because it seems such a simple thing to deal with, and when it comes to real practicality and making it work, it doesn't. One of the key parts of, a number is a number. And so we always sit down, people say, what does this mean? 10%, 40%? 80%. So in relationship, what might that mean to anything? So when you pick a metric, a measure, make sure that you can stay with it for a period of time. So you can start gauging it. What is it doing? You have to have a perspective in which to interpret it, so you can make some good managerial decisions. One way you can maybe do that is to get information from this. There's an it's a nonprofit, or not a nonprofit. It's an association called KpiLibrary.com. Folks can join that. They can share KPIs. They can get ideas on what might be happening in a particular industry, so you can have a perspective on what that might be. So that's really important to make sure that we have that involvement. We have the perspective we can move forward and make a difference. And then, as Erica mentioned before, and I want to go on to put another label on, is the lead lag. Erica had mentioned about customer satisfaction is more of a strategic issue, and then we've got some operational things going on inside, and who knows. So the lead lag being a history lesson, and that was basically the reason that the whole balanced scorecard thing came together by Capel and Norton about 20 years ago, was that the finances are a history lesson, and the last thing we want to do is get a bad history lesson. We want to make course corrections before we get there. So in your particular organization, if customer satisfaction is a key point, or loyalty is a key item that you're trying to drive, you don't want to wait for the end of the quarter, end of the year, or whatever else, and find out that the number has not gone the way you want it to. What is driving your loyalty, your customer satisfaction number, your particular industry? So like Eric had mentioned, it may be on-time shipments. And if your on-time shipments are starting to drop off, you're going to know way in advance that you're going to have some trouble in that area. So make sure you have the lead lag followed all the way through. And then when you'd mentioned with the KPIs, so much of the time we see when we're working with folks that because they don't want to take the time to work on things, they will do this completion. Well, I got this thing done. It's 100% completion. That's my measure, and that's not really a good way to come up with a measure. Take time to make sure you put a number to it. If you got any thoughts to that?
I do. I think that it's easy for some people who are maybe advanced in strategic planning and strategic management to put together lead and lag measures. And Howard and I always debate about this just a little bit. You know, my approach is get something going and don't spend months trying to get perfect measures in place, because it's not going to happen. And they're probably going to end up changing anyways. And to Howard's point, leave them in place until they're not working for you and they're not meeting the requirements that we talked about earlier about whether they're telling you the strategy is working. But sometimes we do have goals or objectives that are project-based. They are completion-based. And so I would submit that sometimes we just need those, because we don't need a perfect quantitative measure to measure everything all of the time. Now, if it's an important strategic activity, we need to make sure, let's go back to customer loyalty, fine. But I just think it's worth giving ourselves a little bit of grace to say, hey, you know what, let's get something going. Let's talk about looking at the status of our strategic direction on a more periodic basis, and if it has to be percent complete, so be it. That said, I think one way to push past that a little bit is when you're sitting and looking at your goal or looking at your objective. I think a great sort of quick tip takeaway on this is, what is the outcome of that goal or objective? And that really should help you define what the measure is. So just wrapping up on this subject, here are just some summary actions. Identify the right measures. I really think it's important, back to those initial things that we talked about. It needs to tell the strategy story. Measure what counts and what matters to your organization. Establish increments that mesh with the targets, i.e. if we can't get the data monthly, then we get it quarterly, so make sure the increments mesh with the data, or with the targets and the timing that you can get the data. Identify the data source. Determine your collection tool. You're using an Excel spreadsheet. We have an online system. There are a lot of other online systems. How are you going to collect the information? Who's responsible for that? And then checking it out each quarter to make sure that those measures are telling you something about the strategy.